Welcome to the Dropping into Power podcast, where we'll be hearing stories about the transformational power of surfing from women surfers of all ages, all levels, and all over. We'll hear about courage, commitment, struggles, frustration, epiphany, and, of course, life transformations large and small. I'm your host, Sheila Gallion, and I am stoked to share these conversations with these amazing women full of so much passion with all of you.
Jeepers, the nerve of that young whippasnapper. He looks right at me, sees me going for the wave, looks right at me, takes off, rides the whole way right in front of me, squiggle pumping his little soft top with the one fin. It's a tri-fin setup, but it's only got one single fin in the back, about a 5-inch fin, squiggling. Rides the whole way in front of me, kicks out. I'm right behind him the whole way. And he looks back and he says, "Oh, sorry. I didn't know you were still there." Well, Sonny, I may be slow as a moose stuck in the March mud up to Maine, getting to my feet. If and when I get to my feet. But when I do, if I do, I still know how to surf, Sonny. So you watch your manners and stay out of the way, old Auntie Mo.
Aloha and welcome to the Dropping into Power podcast. Well, I'm pretty excited today because I am getting to talk to you. This is going to be really kind of an unusual episode in all kinds of ways. But you know what? I didn't ask you before. I'm pretty sure you're going by Auntie Mo. Yeah?
Yeah. That's how we say it up to Maine. Auntie
All right.
Mo.
So Auntie Mo came into my consciousness probably when she came into a lot of people's consciousness, which is when a Surfline video went viral. Now, I had actually previously interviewed somebody who had very clean cuss words, clean cuss outs in terms of, how she dealt with the youth in the lineup. Young man, don't you talk to me. I mean, she was really funny. And so it really, in addition to just this being such a great rant, it really stood out for me just because of the cleanness of it. And I am going to actually play this, Mo, when I actually do the recording. I'm going to edit it in so people can hear it that didn't hear it. But basically, this viral video, I can tell you some stats. On Surfline itself was shared had 34,000 likes. It was shared 8,470 times. It has 644 comments. Most of those are tags, so most of those are shared. And this doesn't come close to representing what really happened with this video because I shared it. Everybody I tagged shared it. Everybody I know shared it at some point in the surf world. So I don't know the real numbers. Auntie Mo's really an extraordinary water human. And just in addition, I had no idea until I started going through her feed that she's a shaper. She's an incredible photographer. And Mo, I'm going to grill you on your water knowledge in terms of surfboards, because I know that definitely everyone listening wants to know more about hydrodynamics. But anyways, I just want to say welcome. And it's so fun to have you. We struggle through terrific tech challenges getting to this point. And you were just telling me the story of actually, where you were on Instagram versus what's happened since then and how you kind of described it that you're writing this great way. But tell the story of this video. Like, how did this all happen?
Well, I think, I tried to analyze it myself, and it's like, why did this particular video take off? And a couple of things. I'm turning 65 next month.
Woo-hoo.
And surfing, at least on stand-up boards, it'll be 50 years this coming summer. I really kind of started on little foamy belly boards when I was younger, but I count 1974 as my start date. And like a lot of older surfers who've been through the earlier times when, especially in New England, I'm sure in California, it's always been crowded. Hawaii, they've dealt with that. But in New England, we used to drive down the road. We could see our friends and count on, a couple of hands how many surfers there were in the area. And I think older surfers have a tendency, it's kind of a twofold issue. Their abilities tend to dwindle, and the crowds have been ever increasing.
And with the advent of all the new technology, the new wetsuits, especially in New England, so it's really easy as you get older to get really grumpy. And I was trending in that direction. And I couldn't surf the way I used to. I used to be a pretty good surfer, by local standards. And I didn't like the way it made me feel being grumpy all the time. I go out and I wouldn't have a good time, and I'd be grumpy because I couldn't perform. I'd be grumpy because I was competing with other surfers who were much younger and had more energy than me. And even when I would line up a wave and be in perfect position, there always seemed to be somebody that was either going to drop in on me or they were going to out paddle me and take the wave and just be more aggressive. And I didn't have it into me to be aggressive anymore. So I think when I made that video, you know, it maybe, I'm guessing it touched a chord with a lot of surfers, because surfing has gotten so crowded these days, everywhere on the planet you go where there's surf, and there's surf everywhere there's an ocean or even lakes. It's crowded. Everybody, the joke is everybody surfs. And I made a conscious decision that I didn't want to be that grumpy old surfer out in the lineup anymore. And I didn't want to be a grumpy person to begin with. As you get older, I work in a nursing home around elderly people, and I realized that a lot of how we get through life is based on our own attitude, and we're fully in control of our attitude. And you can choose to be grumpy, or you can choose to have fun. And for me, surfing started, it was all about fun. The act itself was fun, but it was also about the people in the water around you, your friends, the locals that you know. And, when I started, everybody was a character. They were all unique individual characters. And you look out in a lineup now, and they just look like a bunch of clones out there. And I'm sure everybody has their own individual personalities, but it's harder to get to know those individuals when you look out in a lineup and you see 30, 40 people out there, as opposed to, maybe 10 when I was, at my heyday. And you got to know each one of the characters in your tribe. And so anyway, I think the video touched a chord in that sense. Why I decided to make that video, well, I'm part Irish, and I think sense of humor comes, it's my birthright to be full of humor. And I just thought it would be a funny little video that, if people might be shocked to realize that on the day in question, when this young surfer rode the entire wave in front of me, it was literally a knee-high wave. And there was only 3 of us in the water that day. It was me, my friend Dale, and who was a frequent co-conspirator in our watery adventures, or like today on the beach, and this one young kid on a soft top. And I've seen it before. The kid looked right at me as I was going for the wave, and it was a nice little wave. And I struggle with my pop-up, as a lot of older surfers do. And I managed to get up relatively cleanly. He might have thought I wasn't going to make it, so he went. And I rode right behind him the whole way. I mean, once I'm on my feet, I can still surf pretty decent. And he kicked out. I kicked out right behind him. And I always do that when people drop in on me. I make sure I get right out behind him so they know I was there. And he looked back with kind of the shocked look on his face, like, "Oh, I didn't know you were still there." Like, what do you mean still there? Like, you expected I was off. It's like, listen, kid, I've been doing this a long time. And so anyway, he apologized and everything else, and that was cool. I mean, it's knee high. Come on, you don't fight over knee high waves.
Yeah.
And the 3 of us were just having fun and goofing out in the water, which kind of brought me back to how it was when I was younger with some of my friends. We would all just goof. We'd go out in the worst crumbly, crappy, knee high, onshore, blown out. And, I had a friend, my old friend, local legend here, named Dick Lovell. And we used to sit up on the beach for an hour just checking the waves. And we'd finally, at one point, one of us would look to the other and say, "Well, I've been out in worse." And that would be all we needed to paddle up, paddle out and get suited up, paddle out and go out. But anyway, I came in from that day at the beach, and I thought, well, I'm just going to make this funny little video for my friends. I got some followers on Instagram, and I'll just make this goofy little video. And, it was mostly meant tongue in cheek. I wasn't serious. I mean, I was ranting, but I was in character ranting. And Auntie Mo it's not that I'm not Auntie Mo. I am Auntie Mo. Auntie Mo is very much me. But I developed this Auntie Mo character, the longboard I currently ride, I made it 10 years ago, and I wrote Auntie Mo model on it. And one of the reasons I wrote that, because even back then, 10 years ago, I was still struggling with this whole being the grumpy oldster out in the lineup. And I was trying to overcome that. And I said, well, maybe I'll just be the kindly old auntie. And that idea in Hawaiian culture, as I understand it, of, the aunties and the uncles out in the water, they're kind of there to mentor and guide the younger surfers. And, that feeling of extended family, the ohana and everything else, and kind of like, the African tradition of it takes a village. And it's like, we're all a big family and a tribe, and we all should be supporting each other instead of bickering and fighting with each other. So I came up with this character. And then for a few years, we went to live down on Nantucket. And I'm already rambling. It didn't take much to get me started. But we went down to live on Nantucket, and I kind of miss Maine. Maine has been my spiritual home for a long time. I've lived in other places, but Maine has always been home in my heart. And just kind of to make me feel, more connected, missing Maine. I came up with this character, Auntie Mo, and I would do these little videos that I would send, via social media to my friends back home in Maine and New Hampshire. And, I would give weather reports and surf reports, stuff like that. And so I just kind of adopted this persona, and I, gave an exaggerated caricature Maine accent, which, is not meant to poke fun at the accent or the people, because I adore them, and it's more of an honorific towards the people of this region. And so, you put those two things together, that, the idea of an auntie being, the mentor out in the lineup, and, being from Maine, which, let's be real, in surfing, most people have never heard of Maine, let alone know anything about Maine, and New Hampshire too, because New Hampshire is just over the border. I literally live on a bridge that separates Maine, and on the other side of a bridge that separates the two states. And I've lived in both states. So I'm kind of connected to we call it the seacoast area here. New Hampshire's got, I don't know, it's like 15 plus or minus miles of coastline. Maine's got considerably more, but New Hampshire has a lot of really good quality surf breaks. And
I think it's news. I think it was news to a lot of people that there's that much surfing in New England, and I went through some of the comments, and people were really asking about the accent, which I'm not from there, but I think what you really feel in that video, in addition to everything else, like, it's funny, but there really is just so much love in it, for lack of a better word. Like, you can feel the love of surfing. You can feel just, you can feel this kind of mentoring, coaching, done with just a lot of humor and spark. But I saw some comments where people are trying to figure out your accent. One person is like, is she from New Zealand, South Africa? There's some hilarious comments about the accent.
Changed accents 5 times. And I'm like, no, I didn't. You've just never heard the Maine accent. The funny thing was, I did feel a little bit of validation that there were some comments from people who are local to New England who know that accent. And they kind of validated that it was authentic. And like I say, it's exaggerated, it's embellished, it's a little bit of a caricature, but the essence of it, I think, is honest and true. And like I say, it's meant to, pay homage to New England and Maine specifically. I absolutely love where I live. I grew up in a military family. We traveled around a little bit when I was younger, until my dad retired, and then we moved back to this area. And I just love it here. I haven't really traveled extensively. I haven't been to a lot. I've never been to Hawaii. But I've lived in other places. And I think there's a distinction between living in a place for a time as opposed to just traveling to visit a place. Or current times with regards to surfing, people make these quick hit and run, excursions to, oh yeah, I'm going to go catch the swell at, whatever exotic location is. And then they move on, and you get nothing out of the experience other than the waves you caught.
Yeah.
And
no, that's a good point. Yeah.
For me, it's more about getting to know everything about a region or an area or, a town or whatever, or a surf spot, and taking more time to settle in and get to know it. And that's always meant more to me. Maybe it's because I felt rootless as a youngster. traveling around, that I yearned for a place to call home. And we used to vacation at the same cottage in the same town in Agunquit, Maine, which just happens to be one of the best surf breaks, not only in Maine, not only in New England, but I feel on the entire East Coast. It has one of the best breaks. And then there's other good quality breaks, a short drive north or south. But it's just felt like a spiritual home to me being in Maine. And, whenever I was away from Maine, living either on Nantucket or in New Hampshire, I was always like yearning to get back to Maine.
So
And
when you
we were
started surfing in the 70s, where did you start surfing? Was it in Maine?
It was in Agunquit, Maine. My family started vacationing in the early 70s. We had a big family. There was 7 of us kids.
Wow.
And we rented a cottage. It was supposed to be a one-off. My parents thought, my father had just recently come back from Vietnam and all of that. And I don't know what prompted them. That you'd have to ask them, and they're both gone. But they decided we were going to spend a summer in Maine, July and August. And they found a cottage, and it just happened to be in Agunquit. And we started playing in the surf, and we, water people. We were doing all sorts of activities, canoes and rafts and tubes, and in the ocean, riding waves on these little foamies. And that kind of coincided with, I had seen The Endless Summer when I was probably, 7, 8 years old, when it first came out in the global distribution at the movie theaters.
Yeah.
My older brother took me to the movie theater, and I saw The Endless Summer, and my eyes were just agog at the screen. I was mesmerized. I kept looking at the screen. I'm like, what 7 or 8 year old kid will watch a movie and look at the screen, and I got to do that.
Yeah.
I kept thinking, I have to do that. And it was a few years after that that I got my first, stand-up surfboard. But it stayed with me, and it never left. And every time we came back to Agunquit, we'd go out on those little foamies. And then when I got old enough, one of my younger brothers and I, we both decided we wanted, the next summer, we're going to buy surfboards. So we saved up babysitting money, because my parents were, in those days, they sure as heck weren't going to buy us a board or wetsuits or anything else.
Right.
So we both bought surfboards. Like, we started pestering our parents like day one. We got to Agunquit, and we're like, when can we go get our surfboards? We had to shop around to find them, because in those days it was only, I don't know, the surf shop I bought it, all they had was surfboards, wetsuits, and wax. That was it. No soft goods or anything. It was just hardcore. And my brother found a used board, in somebody's backyard. That's how we started. And we never looked back. The wetsuits we wore back then were old hand-me-down dive wetsuits. My brother's wetsuit, the zipper wouldn't even close because it was all corroded. So we took a bungee strap and wrapped it around his waist and around his chest, and tied it together in a knot with bungee to hold his wetsuit
Oh, that
closed.
must have felt good while paddling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He had the paper tails hanging down, and oh my God, let me tell you, we used to get the worst rashes under our arms, inside of our elbows, backs of our knees, our necks. Oh my God, it was horrible. When rash guards first came out, it was like, oh my gosh, nirvana.
Wow.
We have for the rashes.
You have a funny Auntie Mo post about wetsuits, people surfing in the cold versus, when you started. So, let's talk about the progression of wetsuits in your time, starting from the bungee cord till now. Yeah.
Well, that old bungee cord my brother had, and mine had a working zipper, but it was, it was a dive suit. And in those days, the basic dive suits were a 1/4 inch thick, and you wore these pants. They were literally pants, but they went all the way up to just, halfway up your chest, under your armpits. And then you had a jacket with a front zip, and then the beaver tail. But the beaver tail had these little buckles on it, but you had to leave it unbuckled, because otherwise it would dig into the deck of the board. So you had that beaver tail flapping around as you were riding your waves. But we used to walk 2 miles home from the break, across the beach and up over the dunes. And then we would either walk across, it was a tidal river, and it was either shallow enough to walk across, or we'd paddle across. So it was quite a hike, 2 miles through the snow, uphill both ways kind of deal.
Yeah, right.
But when they first started making surfing specific wetsuits, there was one shop in York Beach, was just south of Algonquin, called Bikini Surf Shop. Interesting story there is the owner of that shop, it was an older couple. They had a daughter who was actually married to Warren Bolster at the time. He was a famous old surf photographer
Okay.
in the surfing magazines. But that's just an aside. But we bought our first wetsuits there. And it's like, wow, these things are made for surfing. But really, in recent times, the wetsuits are such a game changer. People don't have any clue what it used to be like that. And I made that video because I see so many people out in the water now that they don't realize, what we dealt with in previous decades. And like I said in the video, my first winter suit didn't have a built-in hood. It was a O'Neill original, and it had a nice sealed neck, and it had a front zipper instead of a back zipper instead of a front zipper. So the zipper was across the shoulders, which is kind of binding and stiff. And it was measured in, inches, increments of inches, not milliliters and millimeters. And it was 1/8 of an inch thick, which I did the conversion on Google one day, and I'm like, oh my God, that was a 3 mil that I was going out in, 30 plus degree water in the middle of the winter. And
so what year was that
was not
roughly?
something anybody would wear in that water
Oh my
nowadays.
God. Yeah. Do you remember what year that that first thickness came out?
That suit came out in the later 70s because the first couple of years of me surfing, my dad was at the Pentagon, so we were still commuting back and forth from Maryland, DC area. When he retired in 75, we moved back to this area, but the really good suits came out, a year or two later. But even then, they were too thin.
Yeah.
Because O'Neill is based out of California, and I'm sorry, but California's idea of cold water is not the reality of somebody surfing in New England in the winter.
Yeah.
And it took a while for the wetsuit manufacturers to catch up with what we were dealing with back east here in the Northeast. And when I say Northeast, I'm including everything from like the mid-Atlantic states, from even as far south as the Carolinas, all the way up, to Maine and Nova Scotia. And, we get warm water in the summer, what we call warm water. But when it drops down in, to us, 50-degree water is not cold yet. It's when it gets down below 50 into the 40s, which is where it's at now. And then in those days, it would drop down into the low 30s. It doesn't seem to do that as much lately. It hovers right around the 40-degree mark, sometimes dipping down as low as 37, 38. But there's a huge difference between 38-degree water and 48-degree water or 58-degree water. And the way things evolved, I think it took a while for the manufacturers to realize that, hey, there's people surfing, back east that need these suits to survive and to enjoy themselves. So they started making the suits thicker. And that was a game changer. That opened it up to people who would never even consider going in the water. And all of us, more wizened and older surfers, stupidly said, oh, yeah, it's not that bad when you got the right suit. It's like we should have told them the realities of the way it used to be. I used to come out of the water. I would crank the heater in my car. I would sit there shivering. And, that's not an exaggeration. I would be out in the water in the lineup, and you'd first start shivering. And then when you stop shivering, that was a sign. And I researched, that was a sign of hypothermia. And when your speech would start slurring, again, exaggeration, when it's like, okay, the next step is unconsciousness and death, so maybe it's time to get out of the water.
So how long would you stay out in those kind of conditions in your 3 mil wetsuit?
Yeah. But back then, after an hour, you were really cold.
Okay.
An hour and there's some hardcore people that'll say, oh yeah, I was out there for 4 hours. That's a bunch of baloney, maybe 2 hours. But you'd have to come in and warm up, and usually you'd come back and sit in your car. And if it was really, really good, you'd try and warm up in the car, and then you might paddle out again.
Yeah.
But, I can remember the typical scenario in those days was coming home, pouring as much hot fluids as I could down my gullet, hot soup, hot cocoa, jumping in the shower for 20 minutes to half an hour, trying to warm up, getting out of the shower, bundling up with as many layers as I could, and still sitting there shivering as the
Oh
core
my
temperature
gosh.
comes back.
Surfing in
And
that. So I've often told the story because I started surfing in Humboldt County in Northern California, which doesn't
it's
get to
about
you guys. It's like 47 to 54, 50. And
right.
when you say you can tell the difference between 38, 48, and 50, I believe it because I could tell the difference between 48 and 47. Like I
Yeah.
would know when I walked out the level of
Yeah.
ache in my ankles.
Yeah.
And, where I surfed, I had gone to college there in the late 80s, early 90s, and nobody surfed. And then when I
Uh-huh.
moved back in like 2000, there were all these people surfing. And I'm like, what the heck? Like I used to just sit above this beautiful point, Camel Rock, and it was like my spirit home. I totally relate to what you're saying. And I would just go there when I was in a mood, and cry and whatever, and the waves would crash, and it was my spot. And then suddenly, there were people surfing down there, which is when I became obsessed. I just couldn't believe they were out there. I'm like, how is that possible? But it was the wetsuits. And I remember hearing about, a couple of people that would surf there without wetsuits. But I started in a used 4 mil, which was shredded and threaded and, no booties and I would be numb in like 30 minutes, but I
Yeah.
still thought that was pretty awesome. And then I got my first new 4.43. And then I finally got 7 mil booties and gloves, but I never surfed beyond a 4, which now, I mean, I don't know, 5, 6s, but so to imagine that and taking it down 10 degrees and then, oh my God. Yeah. I mean, that
Well,
is fortitude.
the one thing I didn't talk about in that video, because I was trying to keep it as short as possible, but and I have trouble with that, is some of the ones I've done on my surfboards, I've gone way over. Part of that's just because I'm passionate about it.
Yeah.
But I didn't talk about, not only were you dealing with the core temperature issue of hypothermia, but I didn't mention the frostbite too.
Oh my God.
And your fingers and your toes, 7 mil booties didn't exist in those days.
Right.
And 5 mil or go home. And I would stay out in the water until I just couldn't take the pain anymore, because the frostbite cold is a different type of cold than core cold. It's like a painful cold. It's not that, you're shivering and slurring your speech. It's just like, this is painful. My toes and my fingers are painful. And, some of the people correctly noted, and I think people on both coasts can relate to this, coming out of a cold session and you can't turn the key in car to get in the car, and you're sitting here like, and you see an old man walking by, hey, can you help me open my car? And I think anybody that's been in water, in the 50s can relate to that kind of cold.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's, so you're dealing with the hypothermia, you're dealing with the frostbite, and, the 7 mil booties became standard around here. Now a lot of people are wearing 8 mil booties. If you have a good mil booty, it's doable. I typically will wear a liner, a sock, and in the warmer water, I wear just a lycra sock. When it gets colder, I'll put on a fleece lined one. Some of that is for extra warmth, but it's mostly to help facilitate getting my boots on, because I'm older and stiffer, and I have back issues, and I have to be careful getting in and out of my wetsuit. That's one of the biggest determinants of whether I'm actually going to paddle out. It's like, is it worth the effort of getting in and out of my wetsuit? So, for me personally, those lycra or fleece lined socks, and I wear a long sleeve rash guard because I can slide the suit off of my shoulders and down my arms a lot easier, getting out of it and getting into it as well. Nobody wears rash guards under the wetsuits anymore, because the wetsuits are made to be smoother and, not as restrictive. But I still have memories of walking those 2 miles back from the break to my home and getting the chafed armpits. And so when rash guards came out, that was a game changer for us in, the woods. And I've worn them under my wetsuits ever since. In the warmer months, I wear a short sleeve one under my suit. And in the winter, I wear the long sleeve one, partly because that's ingrained in me.
Yeah.
But it's funny to me that nobody wears rash guards anymore. Even around here, they don't wear rash guards under their wetsuits.
Well, it's funny because I thought living in Hawaii now that a rash guard was to prevent the wax, the rash from the wax on your board, not from your wetsuit. I didn't know that it was actually supposed to go into your wetsuit at some point, that there was a time for that.
You say that. I started on those foamies way back when I was just a real young kid. We used to wear T-shirts because those foamies were very abrasive.
Right.
After 15, 20 minutes out in the water, your whole torso would just be all torn apart and red and, sometimes to the point of bleeding almost. But of course, we loved it too much to stop.
Right.
But the idea of wearing T-shirts out in the water. So those were the early rash guards, I guess. But that was because the foam, because they weren't glassed. It was just a slab of styrofoam, and it was very abrasive on the skin.
Right.
Those old memories die hard. But the wetsuits are definitely a game changer, I think, on both coasts, but especially around here. Like I tell. People don't realize there's waves in this area of the country, even people that are local here. I get people, acquaintances, coworkers and stuff. They ask me all the time when I tell them I surf, and they're like, "You can do that here?" And I'm like, "Yeah, we can do that here," because in New England, most people only go to the beach in the summertime.
Right.
And the summertime is when it goes flat here. And
okay.
so
Got it.
They only associate, their frame of reference is seeing, at best, maybe 2-foot crumbly waves onshore, soft breeze blowing off the water. And that's their whole frame of reference. And maybe when a tropical storm comes in, if they just happen to be on the beach that day, and they'll look out and say, "Oh, gee, look at the big waves," and, "Oh, are those surfers out there?" But they don't associate, surfing with this coast. And they all
makes sense. Yeah. So when does the surf start then, like roughly in that area?
The funny thing is, because I think most regions have their flatter times. And for us, it's the months of, maybe mid-June to mid-August. And then usually the tropical storms will start kicking in. And my cat is coming over here to join me.
Oh, good. We love cats.
But that's typical of the tropical season with the tropical storms. And that's our first swell activity this year. And this was an anomalous year. It was the longest stretch of continuous surf that I'd ever experienced in my 50 years of surfing. But we had 40 plus days. It was probably 45, maybe even nudging 50, but at least a good solid 40 to 45 days of continuous surf. Now, it wasn't always big and, exhilarating and all that, but it was consistent surf. And that's the main thing that we lack around here is consistency.
Yeah.
Through the middle of August, right through this time of year is fairly consistent. We're getting waves. Usually we'll have 2 or 3 days at least of waves a week. And, granted, some of those days are just small, thigh high to chest high longboard days. But, the surf gets pretty consistent. Once the winter kicks in, we get nor'easters, and the typical pattern for nor'easters. But again, that trend has been changing along with the water temperatures. We seem to get more storms more frequently. But in the old days, the typical scenario was a nor'easter would come up the coast. It would blow hard like it is today. The ocean would be a mess. And then the winds would switch back around from the northwest, blow offshore all night. And you wake up the next morning and you got dream waves. And it's like, yay, we got real surf. But a lot of times those winds would blow so hard for, all day long. Maybe a day or two later, the swell would be gone. So you get maybe 2 to 3 days of good surf. And then you have to wait, maybe another week. Or sometimes in the wintertime, we get flat spells that are just as long as the flat spells in the summer. But when the storms come in, they're pretty powerful. And, we get some good surf. And it seems, it's my perception, I guess, that it seems like we get swell more frequently than we used to. and like I said, granted, a lot of those are longboard days, but
Yeah.
longboard's still surfing.
Oh yeah. Hey, if you're paddling, you're paddling, you're surfing. So
And I'm
this,
not giant waves anymore anyway. So
yeah. Yeah, I really want to hear about that. That part of the journey for you is one of the things we chatted about on Instagram that was interesting because a lot of people, when I started this podcast, a lot of the people that I interview or people who are new to surfing and who are starting at all different ages, the
mhm.
latest being starting at 67, starting in your 50s, starting in your 40s, starting in your 30s. And part of it is because generally the subject of this podcast is how is surfing transform your life, and most of us don't have quite as much transformation younger in life. So, a lot of the people
Yeah,
I've interviewed have had, just a little more story. But what was interesting to me about your story is that you have been an accomplished surfer and now you're facing this humbling, challenging, just onslaught of what's the word I'm looking for? The degradation of your surfing in this way, which is,
yeah.
and you talked about it in the beginning of how you even found this persona and how you're dealing with it. So yeah, I'd love to hear more
It,
about your journey
it
of how
it's
you're
really
managing it.
hard. A lot of it comes down to what I said before about attitude. And I don't know if you saw the latest Surfline profile they did. A local girl who just got out of journalism school did a profile of me. She followed me around for half a day with a GoPro camera, and she got some shots and interviewed me all day long. And then Surfline edited it down, and they just posted it yesterday, as a matter of fact.
I did see
Um,
that, and both the video and the text is
yeah.
really compelling.
Well,
So
it
yeah.
was a struggle that day because the surf was pretty good that day. And the first place we went to was my home break, which the wind was not quite the right direction. And I knew it would be a struggle to get any rideable waves. It would be a struggle for her to hold position in the water with the GoPro get any. So we went to a more sheltered beach, but the surf was still pretty good that day. And I was so nervous because I'm like, please don't let me kook. Please don't let me kook. And because,
Yeah.
my head, I'm still that surfer. And it's kind of like, oh, I used to be good, so I can't let anybody see me be a kook.
Hmm.
And I think I've finally found the key to getting over myself. And I talk about that a lot in some of my videos. It's get over yourself. Don't take yourself so seriously. And I think that's important because I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much tension and friction out in the water,
Mhm.
because there's so many people out in the water that take themselves too seriously. And the
Mhm.
whole goal of surfing is to have fun.
Mhm.
And if you look really closely in the two waves that she, you know, captured of me riding waves, that I caught a few other waves, but they put two waves in that piece. And the first one, you can see me stumbling and bumbling and looking like, just the total kook that I am sometimes, trying to get up to my feet. And once I got to my feet, I had kind of gotten my timing was off, so I was behind the section, and I kind of blew the wave. But if you look real closely, um, as I'm stumbling and bubbling and struggling to get up to my feet and trying not to fall on camera, I just started laughing, and I was laughing at myself. That ability to be self-deprecating and just make fun of yourself. It's like, don't take myself so seriously.
Mhm.
And that was like the key that unlocked, my attitude of just having more fun with this experience. It's like, I'm never going to be the surfer I once was, but what's the goal? The goal is to have fun. So, turn that frown upside down, clown. It's have fun. So
Yeah.
I laughed through that first wave. And the funny thing is, we went in, she actually got cold because she was treading water, and I wasn't wearing a leash, and I lost my board after one wave. And she went in to help retrieve it, and she was visibly shivering. She was ready to call it a day. And I was thinking, I still didn't get a good one. And I said, well, can we try just one more wave? I promise I'll get one quickly. And so, to her credit, she she did some jumping jacks to warm up, and we both went back out. And I was so zoned in, maybe that's the old me that took over. I was like, I'm going to make this wave and I'm going to do it cleanly and I'm going to do it right. And I did. And it almost shocked me. It's like, oh, I got up to my feet smoothly or relatively smoothly for
Yeah.
some of my age with all my physical infirmities. And, I rode the wave and I'm like, okay, so people can see that I'm not a kook, that, there's still vestigial remnants of what I used to be, which I hope
Yeah.
is conveyed in that one fleeting image of me riding a wave. It's like, yeah, she can still surf, and obviously she once did so. She was a accomplished surfer of sorts. Not world class by any stretch of the imagination, but a big part of it was just changing my attitude,
Yeah.
not getting so down. I mean, there was times I'd be out in the water, and I'm sure some of my friends could attest to it. I'd miss a wave, and I'd be out there swearing and muttering
Mhm.
and not having a good time. It's like, what are you
Yeah.
doing out here? So it's just changing the attitude. And the other part of that is, I talked before about the characters that were around when I first started. Everybody was very unique, individual personality.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was, I think some of it's a New England thing. We are constantly putting each other down. We're sarcastic, you
Yeah.
know, we're always on the lookout for somebody's head getting too big. So even with
Yeah.
this now,
Yeah.
people are like sticking a pin in my balloon, don't get too full of yourself,
Yeah. Yeah.
this is just
Yeah.
riding right now and it'll be over, and then you'll be back to your usual self. And it's like they're poking fun at me, but in a good natured and in a loving way, because they care about me and I care about them. And that's how it should be. That's, to me, the essence and spirit of surfing. Is the tribe is so much larger now,
Yeah.
but within the larger tribe, there's smaller pockets of you and your friends.
Mhm.
And,
Yeah.
you know, like Bear says in Big Wednesday, what matters is your friends. You go out with your friends and you have a good time. And it seems to me, over a good portion of my life, at least bookending the beginning of my surfing life, and now I'm in the waning years, I had it at the beginning and I'm getting back to it now. The middle, when, I was a much better surfer and I took myself too seriously, was in
Mhm.
some ways not as much fun.
Interesting. That's
And,
yeah.
talking story with your friends in the parking lot is as big a part of the experience as what you do out in the water.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, it's probably why, just riffing on this, that when somebody witnesses your wave, when you get that moment, and maybe you didn't even surf it the best, but it was just that moment when you get that, and somebody whoops for you or cheers for you or whatever, or laughs at you. I do spectacular wipeouts. I do a lot of somersaults. Like but there is something when you have that, and it makes the moment last so much longer. It's indelible. It's a whole thing that happens, when it's just in your own mind and it's over and over again, then you might have a really beautiful, glorious moment, but it's kind of more focused on, it might be focused on connection, or, yeah, I finally did that bottom
Yeah.
turn just right. But there's a lightness that you're talking about. There's a lightness, and it is really hard to cultivate with, the people closing in and there being so many more people. So how different, you said you went from a crowd of 10 to 30. Is that what you're looking at now?
Yeah, I mean, the crowds, depending where you go, and I was as guilty as anybody else. And I still, being a photographer, I
Hmm.
take pictures, and sometimes, some of even my friends are not that crazy about me shooting some of the better breaks on the better days.
Mm.
Because they're like, keep it on the down low. We don't want everybody, coming here. And I'm like, my main break, it's no secret, and there are no secrets left.
Mm.
I saw a video the other day of, this company that's putting out surfing maps for the entire East Coast, and then I realized they had one for the West Coast, they had one for Hawaii, and there are these maps that point out all the spots, and I'm like,
Mm.
and I'm thinking to myself, like, wow, you better never go to some of those locations.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah,
like,
for real.
and I look at the websites and stuff that talk about, like, I can look at local surf breaks here and I see the write-ups, to
Mhm.
get people who are coming from outside the area, oh, this break is like this and it breaks on this kind of swell and this kind of wind and everything else. And most of the time they're like maybe 50% accurate. My Maine break, it's kind of like the Malibu of the East Coast. There have always been crowds there. I mean, when I in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of us young people doing it. But when the 80s came around, a lot of people got into it. And then the 90s came around and it got even more popular. And then basically towards the end of the 70s, early 80s, every time you paddle out there, there's a crowd, but not always. And I lived close enough to that break that I could check it on a daily basis. And I found a lot of times when, the crowds were minimal. And there's spots around here, it wasn't until I say the last 10, 15 years, that I started surfing a lot of breaks that I never used to surf before, simply because I could go there. And it's like, here's a perfect dichotomy. That's my dog. Sorry.
It's okay.
Perfect dichotomy is my Maine break. I'm very attached to it. I feel like I'm a local there. It's my break. And come hell or high water, I'm not going to give it up for anybody. And I will put up with, I go out there and I might not catch any waves. I might catch 1 or 2 waves the whole session, but I'm going to continue to keep being a presence there, just so people know old Auntie Mo out, at that spot, she's going to be here and you better keep an eye out. But to counterbalance that, there's a few spots I go to where it's never crowded, and they might not be the best breaks, but it's kind of like I can go to them and feel like, okay, you don't have to compete. You can just relax. You can take the waves that you want. You don't necessarily have to outmaneuver everybody else in the water. So it gives me, the balance between the two of the hyper aggro adrenaline, paddle battling, or the more Zen moments where I'm just sitting out there and it's like, here comes 3 or 4 wave set and I can pick any one of them that I want.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that people seek that out because, around here, spots that were never surfed before, we have some slab breaks around here in Maine that nobody ever used to do that thing. And now that, slab surfing's a big deal.
Yeah.
Turns out Maine is predominantly rocky coast. There's quite a few slabs around here. We even had one of our hurricane swells this past summer where a couple of pros from New York came up and towed into a slab that's down in New Hampshire. And that was the first time I'd ever witnessed that. I'd seen waves at that break before, but it breaks like a quarter mile out to sea on this reef. And it's pretty sketchy out there, but they were towing into it and they were getting these bombs. And I took some photos of it. And it's like, wow, we're legit now. We got pros, towing into our slab.
That's right. Right. That's right. So I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you see this fading away at all? Or do you see surfing staying at this peak? Because it did peak before and die out.
That's an interesting, because exactly as you're asking the question, you kind of answered it. I saw this boom in the 80s, but as the 80s progressed, at least in this area, I don't know about other areas, but in this area, it boomed and then it faded. And then the 90s came and it started to boom a little bit again, but it wasn't a big boom. And then it faded. The worst thing in the 90s was twofold. And I think this is a worldwide phenomenon in one regard, that everybody was riding the wrong surfboards. Everybody thought they were going to surf like Kelly, and they were all on these little rockered out potato chip boards, and they were sub 18 inches wide, 6'2" flip tip thruster, 2 and, barely a quarter inches thick. And, if you're an 180 pound guy wearing 5 mil wetsuit, that board just doesn't make sense, not in shoulder high, New England waters in the middle of the winter. But everybody riding those boards. On the flip side of that, and this might be just a New England phenomenon, the 90s drove me absolutely crazy because everybody started riding longboards for a while. But to my view, they were riding them merely as a crutch to get into the waves sooner, because they couldn't physically compete. They weren't competent enough surfers to catch waves on shortboards. So everybody started riding longboards. And for a while, I felt like the last holdout on a short board. I couldn't catch any waves because they're catching waves, 20, 30 yards further out than me. And I'd have a wave all lined up and I'm like, okay, this one's mine. And then some kook on a longboard would glide into it. And then they just stand there and pose, and they wouldn't surf the wave. They would just stand there. And I'm like, that's just a wave catching tool.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you're going to surf a longboard, at least surf the longboard, the way long be ridden. Don't just use it to catch waves. But we went through that in the 90s, the wrong short boards, the longboard thing, but that kind of faded out. And I think I can't really put a finger on when the wetsuits made the really big change in the 2000s, early 2000s. And the other phenomenon, and I don't begrudge, the local shops that are doing this, but the surf lessons too.
Yeah, for sure.
They're ubiquitous there. And, part of me, again, going back to that grumpy side, is, do I begrudge them? And it's like, surfing's incredible.
Yeah.
Why should it only be limited to me? Isn't that kind of selfish of me to think that I want to keep everybody out of the sport? It's an amazing experience. And, just like we are all in control of our own attitudes, surfing it's a beautiful thing. And if we all approach it with the right attitude, I think, my parents in the day would have said it sounded really trite, but I think it can help change people's perceptions in a larger sense.
Oh, yeah.
There's less to be learned from surfing, and realizing the connectedness that we all have, and not taking yourself so seriously, being a little bit more, altruistic towards your fellow surfers, and not going out there and feeling like you got to catch every wave that comes through, and start sharing more and having fun, making it a fun experience, goofing and riffing with your friends out in the water. I'm not saying that, it's not valuable to push the performance end of things, but surfing, in as far as I understand it, in ancient Hawaiian culture, it was a whole village thing. Everybody was surfing. When the surf was up, the whole village would go, and everybody was welcome, and that was that. And now it's like, we went through the whole localism thing, which is pretty much gone. And there's people that bemoan that, oh, back then we had rules and there was etiquette and everything else, and now nobody knows the rules, nobody knows the etiquette.
It is a really tricky, it's sort of a whole new world of trying to explore on all these different sides. And definitely, there's an enormous surge of women surfing, huge surge of women surfing. And a lot of those women are doing it in community, like with that intention. But then they come up, because I talked to a lot of women, and you come up against this place in yourself where you also want to progress because it's such a difficult thing to get any better at. So that greedy part of yourself just bubbles up whether you like it or not. And that part of you that has fought, especially for those of us that have been surfing a little longer, that didn't have the coaching and the YouTube and this and that, then we can get a whole attitude. Like, I'm not a great surfer, but I paid my dues, and, nobody told me. And it's probably just the balance of being human at this point and having so many people on the planet and resources. It's the scarcity of waves. It's all of that stuff coming up. And and there's the people you just don't like they're out there, but you're just like, I don't like you. I don't like your vibe. You paddled out and you just affected my session because you exist. And then, it's me, not you. I know it's me, not you. But all of that stuff coming up. And so I think these dialogues are so important. Like, etiquette is important for safety. It's important for respect. But at the same time, like you made fun of yourself and this kid on this 1 foot wave, right? Or 2 foot wave. I had it happen to me years ago in Santa Cruz. This guy fought me over a 6-inch wave, I was like, what the heck? But, it's dialogue. It's all we can do is keep talking about how do we poke fun of ourselves for being the competitive monsters we are, but also mentor with some respect. And, it's just finding this balance. Yeah.
And I think for elders in the surf community, it's important we're the ones that can bring back that ethos of, what this experience is can and should be. A couple of things that you said. Number one, the performance end of things. Surfing is, without question, in my view, and I played a lot of sports in my life. I ditched most of them when I started surfing, but I picked up a lot of them again later on, when I realized that surfing wasn't going to keep me fit around here in New England, because we don't get surf often enough. So it's like, you better develop other interests, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
And, don't just be so zoned in on one thing, the surfing thing, develop other interests, have other passions. But it's very difficult. Surfing is hard to learn. And the older you are, the harder it is to learn. And you get to that point where you're an intermediate surfer and you do want to progress. You do want to get better. And in some ways, I liken that to like a martial art. If you take up a martial art, it's a lifelong process of trying to get better. And when it comes to surfing, I think the lifelong process aspect of it is learning how to accommodate your dwindling abilities with grace. And, that's a thing that runs through my mind now, trying to be more, graceful out there as far as how I approach, the whole experience and how I am around others. And, like I say, it's a conscious decision. Do I want to be the old grump out in the lineup, or do I be the one? Do I want to be Auntie Mo?
Right.
I've had many titles in my life. I coached soccer for 25 plus years, and I wore that title of coach very proudly because I took it seriously. I felt my job as a coach is to mentor people, to teach them what I know. And, I don't coach soccer anymore, but I have a lot of surfing knowledge, and why not convey that to a younger generation and give them a better experience? And another example of the tribalism, and part of it's our culture where, we all got our phones in front of our face and and nobody's connecting with each other. It's, you don't go to the coffee shop to hang out with your friends and just chat. I was watching this documentary on the Irish pubs over in Ireland. And it was a documentary, and they went around to all these different pubs. And that was one of the things they talked about, and these oldsters that are sitting on the same bench that they've been sitting on for 40, 50 years, drinking their Guinness. And they said, I don't really watch much TV. I don't spend any time on the computer or the phone. I come to the pub to talk with my mates, and we've gotten away from that. And, like I said, when I started surfing, I knew everybody out in the water. And we talked and we chatted and we goofed and we riffed, and, we'd spend as much time, we'd probably spend more time up in the parking lot just talking story. And there was more of a sense of community with it. And one of the ways of getting some of that back is just smile. Talk to people that you meet. One of the problems that we have, and it's not really a problem, we make it a problem. And I'm sure this is common to most locales in the surfing world. But here in New England, we have one of the influxes that we've had over the last 20 years or so is we get a lot of surfers coming down from Quebec, because Quebec is up in Montreal and greater Quebec area. It's a 6-hour drive for them just to get to the coast.
Oh, wow.
That's a huge commitment for them, but they make it. But one of the issues we have is when they come, and now with the advent of all the, the websites that check the swells, everybody knows when there's going to be a swell, and they know where it's going to break and what the winds are going to do. And they show up a lot of times in these big sprinter vans, and 5 or 6 of them will pile out, and it's like instant crowd.
Oh, wow.
And so there's some friction between the local surfers and this influx of surfers coming from Quebec primarily, but also other locations now. In recent times, we're getting surfers come from other states and stuff. The people from Quebec, there's a language barrier there as well. But I have found when I make the time to interact with them one-on-one, and rather than, I see a group of 5 or 6 of them piling out of a sprinter van, and I was like, oh, geez, an instant crowd, Yeah. But if I see 1 or 2 of them in the parking lot and I chat them up, and they're just they're just stoke surfers like we are, trying to have fun. And they're making a huge commitment, 6-hour drive just to get to the coast, 6-hour drive back. They usually come down for the weekend. They spend the weekend in their vans. You got to give them credit for that. But we kind of, hold them at a distance, and we don't interact with them so much. And I think that's part of it. Smile at people, talk to people. There's so many glum looking, serious faces out in any lineup you go into.
For sure. That's true.
And
it's such a good point, because they're not, it's not gonna, the only thing it's gonna change is how it feels in the water.
Yeah.
It's the only thing it's gonna change, because it's not gonna, people are on their mission. They're gonna do what they're gonna do. So we can just make it better. And I'm as guilty as anybody. I mean, oh my gosh. I have to talk to myself all the time. And, I have a little spot I can paddle to where I'm alone a little more, and then I can get my little moment and then I'm ready to, just make sure that I'm like, because it's really just you that's suffering and all. I mean, really, you can make everybody suffer, but you're really suffering yourself. So I want to ask you, so many more things I want to ask you, but I think we've been yakking a little while. I want to ask you, because of your expertise of shaping, because I was really fascinated. I started watching your board ones, and I'm somebody that has a really hard time picturing hydrodynamics. So this obviously could be a whole podcast in and of itself. So I'm going to try and target a question or two. But let's just say, I mean, the bulk of the people listening to this podcast, we definitely have a lot of longboarders and some amazing, people who really put in the commitment, learning how to work, really surf their longboard, stay in the pocket, do all the stuff. And then definitely people who are transitioning or who are surfing shorter boards, they're really trying to, so maybe say intermediate surfer. So let's talk about it. I mean, and the wave, of course, makes every difference, but let's talk about the difference, say, between harder rails, softer rails. What do those channels do? And tails. That's probably way too much already. But
let me give a broader view. I talked about the surfers that were riding the flipped out little thin, narrow boards in the 90s. And how they didn't work for the bulk of surfers. And I think if you talk to anybody who's got any sense of history, they will admit to that those boards, it was such a stagnant time in surfboard design. A lot of what we deal with in current times with surfboard design, and that's one thing I'm hoping to touch on when I go over some of my other boards. A lot of the design thinking was all geared towards what works in the contest. And 99% of us don't surf in contests. I don't know, maybe in other locales, everybody's into contests, but around here, nobody surfs in contests. And I don't mean absolutely nobody, but, the boards were designed for contests. But in the early days of pro surfing, most of the contest surfing was done in small, gutless waves. Huntington Beach had a contest every year in California. And it was this strange, outside sandbar with this soft spot in the middle. And that's where the Huntington hop maneuver came about, where, they're just basically trying to keep the board moving so they could connect to the inside section and get one more little turn or one more little lip bash off it. And it was so aesthetically displeasing to the eye. But they were surfing for points. And most of us aren't surfing for points. That martial arts aspect of trying to get better. And, to me, I talked a little bit about it, is about the flow. It's really apparent when I'm photographing surfers. And I can see the surfers loading up the move. I can see they're like, okay, I gotta give it a couple of pumps, and then I'm gonna go and I'm gonna hit that lip, bam. That's when and I see it coming, and I'm like, snap! I got the big lip bash. That was rad. And a lot of times they fall or they blow the wave or whatever. But it's like I've got the timing down where I can, I was joking with my friend Dale earlier today. It's like, a good photographer can make anybody look good for a thousandth of a second,
Yeah.
creative composition, cropping, timing, you can make somebody look good, but what happened before and after the wave isn't as readily apparent. And for me, surfing has always been more of an artistic endeavor. It's a dance, if you will. And, when you talk about the arts, my wife is a singer, and it's not just the big notes that you hit in the song, it's the flow between those big notes. And in surfing, I feel it should be the same way. It's how do you flow and connect those moves? You watch old dancers like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and how they floated across the floor. And then they would do this big thing, but it wasn't big and flashy. It's just like, if you blinked, you would almost miss it because it was so fluid.
Yeah.
And then you go back and realize, oh my God, she just kicked her leg up over her head. It's like, but it wasn't like she loaded it up and she did a, like a gymnastic tumbling routine and bang, then she hit that big move,
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where I come from with my surfing philosophy. One of my favorite surfers was a local surfer here. He lives out in the ranch in California now. And to this day, I've never seen anybody, number one, was that tuned into the waves and was just so fluid. When I would try and take pictures of him, though, I never really got a good dynamic picture of him because a lot of it was about his flow. And, he was just beautifully aesthetic to watch him surf. But when it comes to surfboards, going back to that issue of the stagnation of the 90s, I think in some ways it's the greatest time to be, involved with surfing and surfboard design because people are experimenting again there was a lot of experimentation when I first started because it was just after the shortboard revolution and in the 70s, and everybody's trying everything. And a lot of them were dogs, but some of it worked. Some of them had little elements that were interesting and intriguing. But when the contest surfing started, they discarded all that. The first one that came along was Mark Richards with his twin fin. It's like, oh my God, suddenly single fins were obsolete. But not everybody could ride a twin fin. Mark Richards could, and he won 4 championships, but not everybody could ride it as well. So Simon Anderson tacked on a third fin, and it's like now he had that stability and that power, and everybody started riding those, and twin fins faded away. Well, nowadays you see twin fins, you see tri-fins, you see quads, you see longboards, mid-lengths, all the different designs, and everybody's playing around with all the different elements, and they're bringing old stuff back and combining new stuff with it. And to me, that's very refreshing because people are revisiting designs that I think were discarded too quickly, but they're blending in new modern approaches with them. And on the other part of it, you asked about, the channels and the tails and stuff. Let's be real. A lot of it doesn't really make that much difference to the average surfer. You might ride a board that you really like, and it's like, wow, this board rides great. And you'll have no idea why it feels the way it does to you. And somebody could try and explain it to you, and you're not really going to understand. But like I said, everything is valid. Everything works. I was joking around one day. I pulled up a cutting board, and you can surf that. You can use it as a hand plane. You could use it as a pipo. It all works. And those foamies that I started on, it was a slab of styrofoam, maybe about 16 inches wide. It had these channels. That was the weirdest thing. It had these channels in the bottom, which probably gave it a little directional stability, but it was just a slab of foam, and it worked for, as long as you're using it in the way it was intended. I think maybe professional surfers, but sometimes I think they're full of themselves and fool themselves into thinking that they can tell the difference between an eighth of an inch here and a quarter of an inch there. I don't think their senses are that finely tuned to tell such nuanced details. And that's one of the problems in the 90s. The boards got so hyper refined. And it's like, they'd bring the board back to their shaper. And it's like, well, yeah, it went really well on my re-entries, but, maybe take a little, maybe take an eighth of an inch off the nose there. And it's like, really, dude, come on, I mean, when you look at surfing from like the 80s, when tri-fins were at their heyday, as opposed to the boards from the 90s, there's not too much difference other than thickness and width.
Okay.
But all the and the surfers, if you watch the surfers riding the waves, they're not
Mhm.
surfing a heck of a lot different,
Right.
despite those changes in the board configurations and designs. The actual surfing is pretty much the same. I break it into broader, you have longboard surfing, but even in longboard surfing, you have a difference between a high performance longboarding or old school, walk the nose, toes over, that sort of thing. Which I prefer if you're going to surf a longboard, be fluid and artful about it. But shortboard surfing all comes down. And the one trend I'm not a fan of right now is I see everybody riding these sub 6-foot boards, which, some surfers can ride them and they can ride them well. But when I see somebody paddling out on their 5'6" little stubby fish, and the surf is, 1.5 times overhead, I mean, if you can
You
make
have
that work, fine. But to me, a bigger wave demands a longer arc, a longer rail line, so you could draw out those turns, the little squiggly turns. I'm not a fan of squiggly turns, as you might have noticed.
I sort of guessed that. Well, you have
Um,
a great, there's another one of your videos where it's an Auntie Mo, which is about
yeah,
hubris and says,
uh-huh,
don't be so prideful, get yourself a bigger board,
yeah.
when you're in a big water, get a serious board. So it kind of sounds like what you're saying is give yourself enough flotation, really, like, especially so, like, if there was one thing to say to an intermediate surfer wanting to surf a shortboard, what would be for, female intermediate surfer trying to surf a shortboard?
But
What's
I,
your best
what
advice?
it, okay, so it's really hard because most of the boards I make are for my own use. And one of the benefits of making my own boards is I can always tailor the boards for me. What's
Mm,
going to work for me in the specific waves that I'm riding? People say I've got 13 boards in my quiver right now, and everybody says, "Why do you need so many boards?" I'm like, "Well, how many clubs does a golfer need in their golf bag?
right,
Are you
right, right.
in agreement with only your driver? No, they're all for specific purposes." And when you build your own boards, you have that luxury of being able to tailor different boards for different situations, different breaks. It's a little bit harder, and I have made a few boards for customers over the years. One of the first things I always do is ask them a bunch of questions. I ask them a bunch of questions before we even talk about what kind of board they want. Um, because a lot of times they come in with an idea and they saw somebody with a board that looked good under their arm, or they saw
Yeah.
them pull a move and they want to do that. And I always ask them, I visually look at them. How tall are you? How much do you weigh? Do you look like you're athletic or are you not? And I'll even ask them, do you consider yourself athletic or not really that athletic?
Yeah.
Because that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
That's why the pros can make those little, rocket out boards work, because they're extremely good athletes.
Right.
And, you know, I think even with the pros, a lot of times the boards they use and work against them. But, they're going to do what they're going to do. I would rather speak to the everyday surfer. But so how big are you? How athletic are you? And the next question is, how much experience do you have? How long have you been surfing? If
Mm-hmm.
you've been surfing a year or two and you're trying to upgrade from that, 7, 8 foot, you know, um, pop out board that you got, okay, that's good. That's a good progression. You want to upgrade to something, but let's not go overboard. Maybe let's not go from that 7, 8 foot pop out to a 5, 8 quad, little disc. That's not going to work for you, and you're not going to have fun, and you're not going to be happy. And, I talk to people all the time about boards that they've had that they wanted at the time, but then when they found out that they couldn't make them work, they discarded them, sold them, whatever, and they moved on to something else. So I think most average surfers should be on what we call mid-length boards now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, 20 years ago, they were derisively called fun boards. So every board that was between maybe 7 to 8 feet was called a fun board. Isn't that the idea? Now the criteria for what's considered a mid-length is basically anything over 6 feet, which I don't consider 6 feet a mid-length board necessarily.
Yeah.
It depends on the shape and the design. Like I showed my 6'9", which is every bit as much a mid-length type board. It's kind of classic of what's currently in vogue right now, mid-length, but it's a little bit wider. Width makes a big difference. You can go shorter if you go wider, but like I say, back in the 90s when people were like, the boards were ridiculously narrow, and there was no flotation whatsoever. But I think most surfers would be best on, like around a 7-foot board, 7 to 8 foot board. You can still make boards in that range that are still going to be highly maneuverable. And the added bonus is if you don't have a lot of money for a lot of boards, you can make those boards work in everything from knee high to, double overhead.
This is really kind of out of the blue, but I have to, because I went through your Instagram. You've been at this for a while. And there was a time that you were a triathlete, you're a bicyclist. So there was a haiku I found in your text that I have to read, a haiku that it said, "Headwind, I hate you. You crush my will to ride on. I pray for your death." So I just, kind of pop question. Do you happen to have any surf haikus?
I haven't done that. I'm actually working on something right now that I want to make a video of. I don't want to divulge it. It's kind of it's a take on, another piece of literature, but rewrite it in surfing specific. I am still a triathlete. I used to, one of the things when I realized that surfing wasn't going to keep me in shape, I took up triathlon back in the 80s when it was originally popular. And then I stopped for 30 some years. And then I had a friend pass away from breast cancer about 8 years ago. And it had always been in the back of my mind that I had done all these triathlons, but I never did an Ironman. Ooh. And so when my friend passed away, I wanted to do something to honor her. And I thought, well, I never did an Ironman. Why don't I do an Ironman as a tribute to her? Wow. But it wasn't only as a tribute to her. I mean, let's be real. It was partly for me too, because I felt like it was something I had left unfinished. Yeah. And part of that has to do with, as far as my surfing journey goes, there's lots of things I felt I have not realized that were old golds of mine. Like I always wanted to go surf Jeffreys Bay because that long point break is similar to my home break, only on a much, better scale. My home break is good on good days, but it's not world class like Jeffreys is. Yeah. And of course, the original impetus for me was Endless Summer and Cape St. Francis. So I always wanted to go there. And then, of course, every surfer wants to go to Hawaii. I've never been to Hawaii. I've never been to Jeffreys Bay. I've been out to California once, and that was years and years ago. And, so I felt like somebody asked me earlier about, writing a book. And I'm like, well, it's funny you should say so because I'm a writer as well. And I've written 4 novels, all of them unpublished, 3 of which I'm pretty proud of. The other one's garbage. But it was my first novel, and most first novels are supposed to be garbage. It's actually what I went to school for. And besides surfing, writing has been my passion. But, it's like I've been writing as much as, it's important to me as breathing, and for most of my adult life, I've been serious about writing, just haven't realized that validation of having, my big great American novel published. And that kind of, that's a tough pill to swallow when you get to your later years and you realize, gee, that was a goal of mine from way back when. So you combine that writing passion with a goal unrealized. and my surfing goals unrealized. Triathlon was a little bit more accessible, so I'm like, yeah, let's do an Ironman.
Right on.
um,
So did you
it's
do
been,
it or are you training for it?
what's that?
So have you done it or are you training for it?
No, I did it a few years ago.
Wow.
I did it when I was 62. I'm turning 65 this year,
Wow.
and I went to Lake Placid, New York, which was the site of a couple of different Olympics. And I did the race. I made a ton of mistakes because I had never done a race that distance, obviously,
Yeah.
but I did it, and it took me
Wow.
almost all day. I only made the cutoff by 17 minutes.
That's
They give you
amazing.
they give you 17 hours to do it.
Yeah.
But one of the issues I had that day, amongst all the other issues I had, was I had some real bad bone-on-bone arthritis in my knee, and my knee kind of locked up early in the day, and it made it a struggle, not only with cycling, but then the running afterwards. And I knew by the time I finished that race, it's like I blew my knee out playing soccer years ago, and I've had up to that point, I had had 6 surgeries on that knee, or 5 surgeries on that knee. I've had 6 total knee surgeries, one on the other knee. But I knew after I finished the race, it's like I was happy that I finished it. I'm like, damn, my knee really held me back a lot. And so I figured I would address the knee issue, and I went and had partial knee replacement last year. And I spent most of this last year and a half recovering from that and starting to train for a second Ironman. In July, I'm going back to Lake Placid. Part of that is because the competitive side of me is I can do better, and then I also, it's like, it'd be kind of cool at my age, 65, to do an Ironman again. And just the other part of it is like, I just think it's kind of cool to say 2 times Ironman.
Oh, I'd be blown away by one. Well, we'll
Still,
wait for all the new divulgence that are coming up. And then I'll put this in the notes, of course, but it's Waterwoman74 on
yeah,
Instagram. And
yeah.
then on Facebook,
Waterwoman photography.
Waterman Photography on Facebook. Because there's so many. You are a Renaissance woman. So many talents. But thank you so much for talking today. It was really awesome. You're just an all-around kind of spectacular human. So I really, really enjoyed it.
If I could just say one last thing, it's just
Sure.
share the stoke, spread the stoke. That's my mission right now.
I love it.
You're not happy with where you are. Change your attitude. It's all in your control. Don't blame anybody else or any circumstance. It's all in your control. I've been through a lot of stuff in my life and had some really hard times. I lost a house to foreclosure. I lived in the Maine winters for 4 winters with no heat. I went through the summers with no electric or water. And somehow I persevered and survived it all. And I came out the other side, just like coming out of that barrel you didn't think you were going to make it out of. And here I am, and I'm happy to be alive. I'm happy to be, vibrant and able to do the things I do. I work with elderly people who there's so much that they can't do. And I'm around suffering on a daily basis. And the fact that I can still do all the things that I do, it's a source of joy for me. And rather than being grumpy about, I tell my residents this all the time, don't lament what you can no longer do. Celebrate the things you still can do.